Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm Leslie Miley, a tech advisor to Common Sense and the former CTO for the Obama Foundation. I've also held leadership roles at Google, Slack, Apple, and Twitter. We're here today for the next in our Conversations with Common Sense series, where we offer real-time advice for navigating the dilemmas parents may be facing, like distance learning and managing screen time. However, in this case, the discussion is more structural and systemic. Common Sense is often best known for media ratings, reviews, and digital citizenship, and also for curriculum in schools. But the organization also advocates with policymakers and the tech industry to ensure technology works for all families. And this brings up a question, which is how well is tech serving Black families? That's what we're going to discuss today. Issues from the digital divide to social media and trauma to solutions, for example. How can tech innovate to help end bias rather than perpetuate it? So with that, let me introduce you to our guest. We have Dr. Nicol Turner Lee. She is the director of the Brookings Institution Center for Technology Innovation, where she studies and writes about public policy and equitable access to technology nationwide. Previously, Nicol worked at the Multicultural Media, Telecom and Internet Council, a nonprofit that promotes equal opportunity and civil rights in media. We have Catherine Bracey. Catherine is the co-founder and executive director of the Tech Equity Collaborative. She is also the co-founder of Code for All, the global network of Code for organizations. During the 2012 election, time is weird during the pandemic. During the 2012 election, she was director for Obama for America's Technology Field Office in San Francisco. And we have Dr. Toutoule Ntoya. He is an educator dedicated to helping K-12 students continue to achieve by working with students, teachers, and leaders to authentically integrate STEAM, STEAM, in the classroom. Before we get started, a quick note about the program. We'll talk for about 30 minutes and then we'll take questions via the comments chat. We'll prompt you when we're ready for questions and do our best to answer them. We'll be choosing a random selection of questions, so let's get going. I guess maybe the first topic, and we'll pass this to Nicol, is about access, and specifically about the digital divide and how it's impacting students and also families. Common Sense research finds that Common Sense research finds that nearly twice the number of Black students are without adequate access compared to their white peers. And where there isn't access, that affects outcomes. And I think you can see that a lot. And that's specifically even in places like San Francisco and Oakland, where you think it's so close to tech hub, this wouldn't be that much of an issue. But also families are more vulnerable and have less access to opportunities as well. So Nicol, can you talk about digital redlining and how we go about the unequal access to this?
Yeah, no, thank you, Leslie. And as I said to you when we started this, I'm so jealous by your setup there. I have to do something different. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Common Sense Media as well as all of the panelists who are here today. And I want to share with the question that you've asked that we are in a digital crisis. We're in a digital crisis, we're in a race crisis, we're in a public health crisis. And all of these combined, I think, have demonstrated the extent to which we're actually seeing systemic inequalities and discrimination manifest itself. One area that it has always manifested, which is before COVID, is in the digital divide. The Federal Communications Commission has announced recently that there are 20+ million people that are offline. That is disturbing, given that the majority of products and services that are digitized are creating better efficiencies in the lives of all Americans and people abroad. So if you were to look at that 20+ million number, and some people have said it's been undercounted, you add that to the fact that we have 53 million school-age kids that were forced to go home due to social distancing, about 12 to 15 million of those kids who actually did not have broadband at home or accessibility to broadband in their community, and the fact that if you were low income, you had a lower likelihood of having a device. I believe the number is somewhere between 30 and 35% of families did not have multiple devices to even engage the parent when it came to remote working, and multiple siblings when it came to school. That's a challenge. And if you add all of that on top of the continuing and explicit and persistent inequalities that exist when it comes to educational achievement, we are in a crisis in this country, in particular, as we discuss school reopening. So the digital divide, honestly, was real before then, before this pandemic hit, and it's going to be real after this pandemic at some point ceases. And that is largely because we have not paid attention to 3 A's, and I'll end here so that we can have a conversation about this. One is the availability of broadband. We have a problem in this country in understanding the type of data that is required to understand who is connected and who is not, who has a device and who doesn't. Where is there digital literacy training available and where is it not? That lack of data actually lends itself to creating what I think the Common Sense Media report also suggested, an abject failure when it came to remote and distance learning for kids of color. We also have a problem when it comes to the affordability of these networks. Depending if you live in urban America, you may have less competition, so you might have higher prices. If you're in rural America, you may not have an alternative, or you may have to go to satellite, which your family cannot afford. That is a challenge of affordability of choosing broadband over bread is a continuing struggle among impoverished families. And I would say accessibility. What do you do with this to improve the quality of your life? What the last 3 to 4 months have showed us is that we may all think that everybody is a digital native because they carry a mobile device or they have some tablet. But at the end of the day, we were not able to convert that resource into changing the quality of life, of getting our kids into school. We were not able to even leverage the device for things that we're now using that have taken decades for us to change, which are telehealth and teleservices. At the end of the day, Leslie, we have a digital divide problem. And before I stop, I got to do the shameless plug. I do have a book coming out on this next year, early 2021, on the U.S. digital divide. I took a 7-city tour prior to COVID around this issue. And it's just unfortunate that many of my observations across the country have come true. So I'm excited about continuing the conversation, but to give you the lay of the land, we are in digital crisis right now, which is compounded by the other pandemics that are affecting Black people in this country.
That really resonates with me. I mean, I know several people who have children who are in school districts who school districts are saying, oh, just print things out. Some people don't have printers, right? Some people don't, you're right, don't have multiple devices. And what is shocking to me is that this shouldn't be shocking to anyone, because communities of color have already been at a disadvantage. This has put them at a greater disadvantage, and there really has been no structural change to address that. Here in Oakland, I think it was Jack Dorsey who made a donation to the Oakland School District to enable kids to get devices and access so that they could continue their schoolwork. And while I applaud that, and it's something great for the kids, what I also was like is, why don't you give their parents jobs and employment opportunities so you don't have to do this, and so that they can continue to invest in themselves and invest in their children. And this gets us right to we're going to kind of kick this to actually, does anyone have anything else to say? Catherine, Toutoule, do you want to add anything to this? No. Okay. Well, so we'll that's actually great. So we'll just kick this right to you, Catherine, which is it's a good segue. There's a difference between charity and investment. If we saw high wage employment rise for parents, tech creating jobs, then parents could afford their own Chromebooks and hotspots. I actually didn't set this up, but it goes perfectly. Catherine, can you talk about the role tech can play in supporting Black families through actual investment?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Jack Dorsey, because I think that's a really great example. First of all, just a quick word on what tech equity is. We mobilize, educate and mobilize tech workers and tech companies about the structural change that we need to make in order so that as a tech economy grows, a 21st century economy develops, everybody can benefit from that growth, whether they work in the tech industry or not. And obviously, technology is just becoming more and more central to all of our lives. It's less of a nice to have and more of a need to have. And this widening digital divide is really not just a matter of who's got the best tools and who can get on TikTok, but really who can participate in the economy. and in democracy. So it's really critical that we address that problem. And tech workers in particular, just because of their demographic profile in the industry that they work in, have a lot of political power to help address, to put their energy towards addressing those structural issues. So, to your point, I think Jack Dorsey example is really instructive because, he's made, really bold commitments to using his wealth and power to help address the current crisis we're in. Square has recently opened a new office, which opened just before everybody started working remotely. Not great timing, but we were working with Square as they were planning that move to Oakland and really helping them think about how they could use their position as a corporate citizen in Oakland to help create the opportunity that you're talking about. But we do, like, the barrier we end up hitting is on this engagement with structural issues. So the fact that there is a digital divide is really just a consequence of deeper structural challenges, and we're not going to fix those challenges through charity alone. For example, we have a property tax law in California that has benefited large corporations to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars over the last 40 years, that has starved public education of much needed funding. In California, before this law passed in the late 70s, had the best public schools in the country. Now we're in the sort of bottom 20th%. We're dead last in the ratio of teachers to students, librarians to students, and counselors to students. And obviously those, when you defund those schools, the kids who are going to suffer are kids from low-income communities of color. Higher income parents are able to access other private resources that they can use to make sure that their child's education gets supplemented. But we have seen this growing divide between the have and the have-nots because of policy decisions that have consequences down the road. And we really need people to start addressing those issues, especially people in positions of privilege like those who work in tech. So what I'd love to see people like Jack Dorsey do is not just give money to the Oakland School District, but support laws that would make sure that the Oakland School District is funded in perpetuity and it has sustainable sources of funding in the way that public education should be funded through the public, not just through the charitable whims of billionaires.
Charitable whims of billionaires. That's kind of poignant. One of the things that I think about, and I think many people do today, is we are, as a society, kind of under assault with the pandemic, with learning and becoming more aware of systemic and structural discrimination and racism. And my question, I want to put this out to the whole panel, is how and what can we do to help people not become fatigued and try to move on from this when it just becomes too much, because it can become too much. People don't sleep well. They have weird dreams. They, you can tell just looking around the country, people are like, I'm done with this. I'm going to go out and I'm going to put myself at risk because I just can't stay at home anymore. So how can we, and what can people do to help keep this movement and this acknowledgement of these long-standing structural problems at the forefront? What are some of the things that people can do? I'm just going to throw this out of the panel and let it be kind of a free-for-all.
I don't think.
Sorry, I was muted. It seems like, and by the way, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. But it seems like these problems just kind of came out of nowhere, right? People are starting to be more aware of some of these structural challenges, and we're having these conversations, and all these different things are happening. But we've been talking about this for a long time, and I don't think we should think about this in terms of this point in time as it relates right now. I think we need to continue the conversation, and I think we can't get fatigued because all of the gains and everything that we've been talking about, which has been great, but we can lose it and go on to something else and get distracted by some other things. So I almost feel like we have to continue the conversation. We have to continue pushing these issues forward, and we have to continue to find ways for those solutions to come to play. And we have to continue to put pressure on the Jack Dorseys, on the Amazons, on the Googles, on all these organizations to actually do things to change the structure in our organizations. And how can their work and how can their advocacy help us at the school level, help teachers and help students access technology in a real way, bring light to issues of representation and other things that happens in our schools, and make sure that these things are sustainable and that we can continue the work and we can continue to see things move forward. Because it's easy to get distracted, move on to something else. Sports are coming back, bars come back into play, people go out and do things again, and we forget about all the work that needs to be done. So we need to keep these conversations at the forefront and look for successes, and they continue to push the envelope until we can see some meaningful changes.
Right. So I'm a sociologist and who has studied race. And so I'm going to be a little bit provocative here, and hopefully common sense will invite me back, as well as you, Leslie. So I would like to say on the exhausting issue, I've been exhausted since I came out of my mother's womb, right? Race is part of my daily life. It is the intersectionality of being an African-American as well as a female that has actually stayed with me. And it's been the negotiating strategies that I've had to employ throughout my entire life that has made me tired, and I think tired in a way that, particularly in my role right now at Brookings, where I'm a senior fellow, one of 5, the director of a Center for Tech Innovation, one of 2 of us are African Americans, actually run centers in a very large, globally respected organization. That exhaustion will never end, because as John Lewis has consistently said, that we have to continue to make good trouble to get people to be much more woke about the issues that we experience. Where it is exhausting, I think, is for white people who have realized, and I see it in the extent to which people have taken to the streets with Black Lives Matter activists, where they realize that they are living in this reality, particularly under this administration, where, change has not come. And we see the persistence of the type of violations, whether it's in police brutality. But brutality is now streamed on smartphones and shared on platforms that show up over and over and over again, that contribute, I think, to the experiences that you're talking about, Leslie, which is the trauma faced by all Americans at this time. The fact that we have to replay these images just to get the attention of the criminal justice system is trifling at best. And really at worst, if we stop what we're doing, we'll never get to actually unraveling institutional discrimination. As a sociologist, race is a social construction. It's a construction that can be seeded by forms of power. It comes with power in terms of the definition and defining of the narrative of people who have been oppressed, and it comes with the privilege that actually maintains that. What I'm hopeful about in this particular time, this inflection point, is that we're actually seeing, with all of the inequities that actually showed up in every aspect and every facet of American and global life, that people will finally say enough is enough, and everybody will get tired. They'll get tired of seeing Black Lives Matter activists on Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. They'll get tired of the fact that now there are corporations where Twitter is being used to expose the type of egregious behaviors when it comes to the treatment of African Americans. They'll get tired because we're realizing in large school districts that they cannot do a remote access solution because they don't have full connectivity, particularly for their most marginalized and underserved students. So it's my hope that we will channel these efforts. And I think we've seen some of this in the defunding movement, the defund the police movement. We're actually seeing changes. We're seeing a debunking of institutional structures that have maintained this type of division be rebuilt. That is the only way that you can actually get past institutional discrimination, by the way. You have to rebuild the behaviors and the ideologies and what has been poured into that system to sustain it for so long. But I think for people who are listening from common sense in terms of parent and educators, what we have this opportunity to do in this exhaustion and this trauma is to retell the story. Let our kids also be part of this dialogue in ways that they could actually use the internet and the resources that they're seeing online play out, have these conversations in a very fruitful manner. And I think to your point, this is not going to end. It didn't end 400 years ago when African Americans were brought over through the transatlantic slave trade. It didn't happen just 40, 50 years ago with the civil rights movement. It is going to be a continuous process until we sit down and we just say that this is an inclusive, equitable America in which we live. It's sort of like what James Baldwin said. America is this wonderful place with a great history, but we have a terrible conscience that we cannot get rid of. I'm paraphrasing. I think going forward, when we get that acknowledgement to want to be the change agents, I think that's when we're actually going to see the change happen.
This is all I can say to that. That is.
I mean, I gotta keep it real. I mean, I've studied this, and I just can't. Our living room conversations are just explosive. I have a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old, and I've never seen my kids so sensitized to this, right? Because they didn't march. I didn't march. I'm not a 60s baby from the standpoint that I marched in the civil rights movement, but you need these inflection points, but people need to see that tiredness is real. So I love the way you encapsulated that.
This is the real conversation I really do want to have. I mean, you brought up and you touched upon so much, and I want to unpack it maybe for the people watching from home and all around the world. Malcolm X, since you brought up James Baldwin, I'm going to paraphrase Malcolm X. Malcolm X said, we have a collective knife in our back, and if you pull the knife, a 9-inch knife out 3 inches, that's not progress. I think America, by and large, has realized that there's a knife in the back of African Americans and a knife in the back of all marginalized people, Native Americans as well. And we're just at that point now where people are asking, how do you pull the knife out? And we have a lot of progress to make from there. And it is progress that we're going to have to work together. And a lot of it is going to be tearing down systems and reforming systems. And this is, to you, Toutoule, how can technology help now as teachers are in crisis mode of having to teach amidst the constant threat of COVID? And the same thing for students. And something I want to add to that, and I just read this either yesterday or the day before, I think it's something above 80 or 90% of teachers spend their own money to enable their students to effectively learn, or just to make up a little bit of a gap of that happens in school funding that is really hard to do when your students are at home and you're not in the classroom. So how are teachers coping with this?
Well, I think we're in a real interesting situation. I've been talking to a lot of my colleagues about this, and it's an exciting time because I think the education space needed some type of jumpstart. We were doing things, and there was, if you look at data, African American youth, African American males are always at the low end of the totem pole if it comes to any kind of achievement data, right? So what can we do? We couldn't keep doing the same things that we were doing. So I'm kind of excited that we have this brand new opportunity to step into this digital space and really meet kids where they're at. And I'm not sure who talked about this earlier, but there's this opportunity that now our kids can have to really access technology and be at a level playing field. So I'm really excited about that. There's so much tech out there for teachers to hold on to. We've been working with teachers for the past 5 years and getting teachers up to speed in working with technology, integrating technology into their classrooms. So it's easier now more than ever before to integrate technology effectively. That being said, given what we read from the Common Sense report, there is tons of gaps that are happening, not just gaps with our students, the devices they have. We say that some students have cell phones, but the cell phone isn't sufficient. Some students don't have access to a device. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and the school's actively sending devices to students. Now, students have to learn how to use a device effectively. Teachers have to learn how to actively engage students in this new space. So there's lots of challenges in that as well. But I think that as a collective, if teachers as a whole can, take this design thinking mentality and find ways to try out something new, try out maybe an oldie but goodie lesson that you had, dust it off a little bit, and let's try some of these tech tools that a lot of districts have access to. That's an opportunity. But the one thing that I really want to talk about is the representation that our students are going to see online in this new space. Now, as an educator and someone who does webinars and professional development for teachers, I am in constant search of representative imagery when I'm putting things up or any materials I'm giving for students or for teachers, and I'm an educator, right? An experienced educator. How do we as teachers now, knowing everything that's happened from COVID to the protest to everything that's happening when our students coming back, how do we make sure that whatever curriculum, whatever we put in front of our students is representative, number one. And then number two, how do we make sure that our students have access to things that actually speaks to them, right? And students also have an opportunity to see their voices in the curriculum, because we can't just say, oh, here's what was given to me and I had to use it. That's no longer an excuse. So we have to be able to kind of sit back, look within ourselves, look within our curriculum and say, is what I'm giving to my students representative of who they are? And are they going to see themselves in what I'm asking them to do? And that's some work that needs to be done, but that is the work that is necessary. And I'm hoping that with all of the professional development that has to happen, with all of the school openings that are going to happen, that our districts and our directors and the people who are putting together this professional development can also talk about this representation of our most vulnerable students, specifically our African-American males. How do they see themselves as being success? And how do they see their voices and what they're learning? And how do they connect with the things that they're learning in a very authentic way? And so I think tech can be a great tool to make that happen, but then tech can also perpetuate some of these inadequacies and marginalizations that are happening. So we have to be very, very, very deliberate when we putting this together. We have to be very, very deliberate in the training. We have to be very, very deliberate how we roll this out to students.
That's great, and really rolls into this next topic, which I really want to open it up for everyone to dive in where they fit in. Kids are getting an immense amount of screen time right now, and more than I think any parent, most parents would be comfortable. Something that is very close to me and what I've done over the years is in working in tech is that this screen time they're getting is providing an amazing amount of data to tech companies about what they're watching, about how they're consuming. And it's building a relationship with them, whether they know it or not. It is extracting information from them that will be used to target information and content to them for the rest of their lives. This, from my standpoint in tech, is really scary, because do you really want YouTube to know what your child is doing at 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, 18-year-old? So when they're 18, YouTube now actually knows more about your child than you probably do, because they have now this just a gargantuan data set to run machine learning on and target ads, target content, target anything that they want. And so I want to just kind of throw that out there, because as you say, like, you want to see representation. Well, the companies that are building these products, from YouTube to Twitter to Facebook, are not represented like we are, right? They do not have people in policy making. They don't have people in product development. They don't have people in engineering who look like us, who are in sufficient numbers and at sufficient levels to adequately change the curve. So there's there's the stop hate for profit, or profit for hate campaign right now that talks about hate speech and harassment and traumatizing images, and we see this all the time. And I have this example that I get almost zero, and I probably shouldn't say this in a public forum. I get almost zero hate on Twitter, and I'm very provocative on Twitter. Yet people I know who we retweet the same things, who are Black women, get an inordinate amount of hate. I mean, it is like scary. I'm like, I wouldn't go on Twitter if I got the shit you got. Excuse my language. I had to put it out there because that's exactly what it is. It's just crap. And so I want to just throw it out as another topic of discussion. What are some examples of how to shift this narrative? How to get these companies to realize that they're actually not only doing harm, but they're profiting from the harm they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with that one, since we work a lot with tech companies. It is a tough one. I think a lot of folks who are looking to answer that question are focused on diversity and inclusion in the industry, which is a critical component. You need people who work in the industry who have lived experience of the potential harms and can speak to that. But maybe an unintended consequence of that approach is that you are implicitly putting all of the responsibility for solving those challenges onto the shoulders of the underrepresented communities, who are then tasked with not only doing whatever job it is they were hired to do, but also, helping the company develop the internal EQ that it needs to answer these larger questions about the product and the business model. And that's where you end up seeing a lot of burnout among underrepresented communities in tech companies, because it is, I have experience, Leslie, you probably do too, of being the only person of color on a leadership team in a tech organization, and having to be the one who is constantly bringing up these questions. It is emotionally draining. And so it's really critical not just to focus on representation and making sure there are people inside the companies with lived experience of the potential harms, but that everybody in the company also takes these things seriously. And I feel, and this is the kind of approach that Tech Equity has taken, for the majority, they have to be given an active role to play. And many of them don't have enough worldly experience to necessarily understand where their blind spots are. And so it's critical to create opportunities for them to develop life experience. Frankly, so whether that's, educational opportunities or, kind of opportunities for them to participate with organizations or in communities where these communities or people live. That's really critical to all of this as well. And tech companies really need to acknowledge that it's not just about, the Black and brown employees at the company. It's about everybody in the company, and start develop mandates to really measure and account for this kind of thing.
Right. So I would suggest, and I love, what has been spoken and how that's been framed, because I do agree with you that we have to sort of get at the level of the lack of workforce diversity within tech companies to figure out where people are situated to help with solving some of these problems. I want to also unpack your question in two ways too, which I think is really relevant as well. One is, what is the impact of having young people, particularly students, online over this very intense period of time? And I kind of want to go back to the previous conversation around education and technology access. We also have to be careful that the technology will not implode on certain students, particularly students of color. So we know, for example, in LA County, that there were lots of kids that did not log in, right? People started to realize later that they didn't have a device, or, kids did not log in, primarily because they were not used to this new framework for remote access in education. We have to be careful, particularly as schools have made major investments over the years and looking at diversity in teachers and disciplinary strategies for African-American boys and girls, at that matter, that we don't use the technology to sort of put into place other areas that may penalize students for their lack of availability of broadband access or a device. So I think I read an article just not too long ago that said, there's this conversation about revisiting truancy for kids that do not log in. Listen, I'm a middle-class African-American woman. I had a child at 13. I could not get her out of bed sometimes because she stayed up so late because of the lack of formality and structure when it came to school. So I want to put that out there as an area, to your point of how young people are contributing more and more to the internet. That availability of that data can also have some consequences for kids when education has access to that data as well. On the side of the responsibility of companies, and I'll just be really quick, this is something I do at Brookings as well, which is looking at algorithmic bias and the extent to which we need companies to think about self-regulatory best practice. What does it look like when you're trying to develop models where there's a potential of flawed outputs simply because you're relying upon data sets that over-criminalizes African Americans or underreports young African-American students? Great example of this is what is now being debated as part of the decisions made by the International Baccalaureate program and that diploma. There are a lot of kids in the United States, particularly kids that came from schools where there were low investments in IB resources, or where those kids perform better on tests, believe it or not, in terms of coursework versus, an algorithm that determined whether or not that their predictive score in the end would actually make them a successful candidate. that type of bias, Leslie, is really real, right? It's a real condition and consequence which can have a differential treatment or disparate impact on students. And as we know more about what students like, what they don't like, how they, what times they're online, what they're not online, it's really on the onus of the company to implement what I think, which are best practices around averting bias, whether that's putting into place bias impact statements or having interdisciplinary work teams. That's really critical going forward, because to your point, we know so much about students, adults, parents, any individual that's actually been engaged online, from shopping to reading to watching movies. And the extent to which we have the appropriate guardrails where people are not going to experience more of an exacerbated and persistent stereotyping as a result of that, I think is a huge public policy concern going forward.
That's actually great. And you said something, and I just read this yesterday. A young lady who didn't log in to do her homework, who was on probation, I think she was 13 or 14 years old, was sent there, 15 years old, was sentenced to jail.
Yes.
She is going to jail for not doing her homework. And they said it was a violation of her probation, which is everything wrong with the criminal justice system as it relates to African Americans. I mean, they're going to traumatize this young lady and put her in a place where she could actually get an illness that will kill her because she did not do her homework. If that doesn't say Black Lives Matter, I don't know what does. Really want to get us to our questions right now. So we have one question, and I'll put this out to the panel, which is what intentional choices from Dr. John, I'm just going to say Dr. John, I'm not going to try to say your last name and kill it. What intentional choices can we make in our education roles to best impact equitable changes in the industry so our students will all have opportunities to get great jobs and sponsorship for higher ed? I think Toutoule, this is a good question.
Yeah, I think one of the things we can consider is access to high-level programming, like like Nicole just brought up IB AP classes, things like that. There's also career technical education classes that students can take. There are also a lot of schools like here in Pasadena, they have concurrent enrollment with PCC, and making sure that we are looking at the enrollment of those classes, because African American students are historically underrepresented in those classes. And how do we make sure that we can pipeline those African American students into those opportunities? Because if you have a CTE program at your school, career technical education, and we're able to get our students in those classes, now that impacts their future, because now they have an opportunity to do work-based learning. They have an opportunity to go on to community college, they have an opportunity to go on to the university level and further their education, but they can earn a living at a high impact, high paying positions, right? And if we can get more of our students doing those type of activities, it can really impact their future. So I think looking at structurally what's happening at our schools, looking at where the gaps are in terms of our enrollment and in terms of participation of our students, and then thinking of ways that we can specifically target those African American students, and not, hey, here's a great program, let's look at, all these other groups, which is great, which is wonderful. I want everyone to get ahead. I want everyone to have a quality education. But now, how are our Black students being held behind on this? And how do we systematically find ways to help our Black students participate in these programs and make sure that they are also attaining at high levels, just like all of our other students? And I think doing those things specifically at the school level can put our students in a good space to where they see success, and they know that, hey, I could be an engineer, or I could be a doctor, or I could be whatever the case may be, and they can see themselves in that role as they go on to college, and they can see themselves in professional aspects, and then they can also start to give back and get those other folks who are other students who are younger than them, who see them as role models and they're having success in this avenue, and they can move on, right? So it's a domino effect, but we have to start structurally with how are we putting our students into these very advantageous positions to be successful. What does that look like in your space? Does it look like an AP class? Does it look like a career technical education class? Does it look like getting them in workforce learning? Does it look like making sure that they're taking these college classes where they're able to work concurrently? What does that look like? And once we can identify that, how do we make sure that our African American students are taking part in these specific courses and enrichment activities to better themselves?
Great, thanks for that. We have time for one more question, and this is from Christina Tanner. What are your top actionable items that you can recommend for teachers in school to take this summer and fall? Let's just open that up to anyone and everyone who wants to answer that. The actionable item I have, and I'll just say it, is do what you can and feel comfortable doing, being safe and keeping the kids safe, and don't fall into the pressure gap for that parents will put on you. This is about the health of you, the health of your family, the health of them and their family. And you're an educator, and we respect all educators. So have at it.
Well, I'll just chime in. I know that we have an international audience here, but if you're in California, you certainly should support the Schools and Communities First campaign, which is now Prop 15 on the ballot. I mean, I'm a little bit shamelessly plugging it, but it's something that we have endorsed, and Common Sense has also endorsed for good reason, because it's a real fundamental structural change that we need in order to make sure that these programs are funded. I mean, it's one thing to say, we need to get these kids into certain programs, but the truth is those programs are not funded. There's no, Oakland Unified, San Francisco Unified of all places has a budget deficit. So these are things that we really need to focus on, and parents, whether your kid is in a struggling school or not, and teachers all need to kind of be ready to get political this fall.
Mm-hmm. I would say to that question, and it's something that I have a blog coming out on this, but I'll share in just a headline framework. I think it's important for teachers and educators, particularly this summer, to start reimagining education, right? And so start thinking about, particularly since there's going to be restrictions with regards to getting kids back into very densely populated buildings or within classrooms where there's a possibility of infection. The bottom line is there's going to be the possibility of reinfection or infection generally if a kid goes home and a parent has it or they're in contact with each other. Somebody was just saying, our kid's going to walk around with masks all day, or there's going to be, it's going to happen until we find a vaccination. We are really in a scary time right now. So what I would recommend to the people who are listening, I think the most important thing is that every single school, I've had the opportunity to talk to superintendents as well as educators and school boards and civil society groups over the last 3 months. It's important that you have a remote access plan, which is the focus of a blog I have coming out later. The key with that remote access plan is that schools need to understand during the summer process, what does broadband access look like within your school district and around the proximity of a school in which you work. We don't ask students that. We never have. We should be asking households when they are enrolling or re-enrolling, who is your broadband service provider? So that schools can engage a conversation around where do we need to actually, bolster Wi-Fi hotspots? Where do we need to find ways to partner with the private sector? Who needs to be at the table at the city if we need to create mesh networks or bring in Wi-Fi enabled school buses, all things that I've written about. But I think it's very important this summer, particularly because we're going to continue to have these junctures where school kids will not be learning. We need to find them stuff to do. I mean, I've got my daughter having a reading list. I'm trying to do what was mentioned, which is to give her culturally appropriate stuff to read over the summer. But we need to prepare for what is going to be both immediate and a long-term game going forward. Remote access is imperative, I think, for any school, both domestically or internationally, to have. And we need the educational community, teachers, administrators, city officials, nonprofit organizations to come together and come up with resilient plans that will allow us to move forward, because today it's a pandemic, tomorrow it's going to be something else. And COVID really has shown just how important being online versus inline really is.
That's a great way to end, and our time's up today. We're actually a little bit over, so I want to thank Nicole, Catherine, and Toutoule for joining us today, and Common Sense for bringing us all together. If you'd like to share this session with other parents and caregivers, you can find it on Common Sense website as well as our YouTube channel. Advertisement there. Definitely share it out. We think this has been a great conversation. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Join our next conversation in 2 weeks on July 29th. We'll discuss teens, tweens, tech, and mental health, a generation of coming of age in a crisis. I think I'm going to pick up on that one. Anyway, have a great afternoon and great day, and be well. Thank you.